Samir Puri, the author of Westlessness, The Great Global Rebalancing. You are Associate Fellow at Chatham House and a visiting lecturer in War Studies at King's College London. Welcome to النهار.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. First, Samir, we had difficulties to find an Arabic translation or an Arabic synonym to the word Westlessness. So that's why we will start by defining this term. As you point out in the book, new centers of power are emerging, and a new generation in the global south looks beyond Washington and former European colonizers.
Yeah, you're quite right. It is an invented term. Obviously, the term is created actually by an organization called the Munich Security Conference, and there's a few people who've written about it, and I'm very pleased to offer my contribution. And I think the crucial thing is the middle syllable, less. So I'm not talking about the collapse of the West or the end of the West or the crimes of the West or anything like this. The argument in the book is that for 2.5 centuries, we've lived in a world where the different versions of the West have had a huge impact on the rest of the world. And clearly anyone who's watching or listening or reading in the Middle East will know in their bones what this means through histories of colonization, of independence, but also that the US era of globalization that the US has spearheaded has also been the defining reality pretty much for everybody that's been alive today, that is alive today. No one can remember a time before the West wasn't the big dominant influencer in the world, if you use the language of TikTok, for example. So the argument in the book is very simply this: that extraordinary level of influence won't maintain itself for the foreseeable future. The next 50, 80 years are going to be very, very different, in which the West remains an extraordinarily important, influential pillar of world affairs, of the international system, of international finance, of culture, of language, but it is not the only one. And the questions posed by the book, and indeed for all of us who are thinking about where our lives, our careers, our children's lives are destined in the next 50, 80 years, is to think about what adjustments will occur when the world becomes less centered around the West. And as a final point in terms of the Westlessness argument, this is really the important one. I'm from the UK. My heritage is from India. I'm joining you on this call from Singapore. And I think to the extent that we have a global outlook in terms of what we do, what we think, and how we feel about the world, it is really incumbent on all of us to think about what's required to rebalance this world constructively. Because there's so much tension, so many crises. Of course, there are bitter conflicts going on in the world. And the danger is that during this transition period, that we face much more risk, much more uncertainty. And that, I think, is one of the big responsibilities we all have, is to understand this rebalancing before we can actually start to mitigate the worst and get the best out of it as well.
As I understand, you are saying the West is going nowhere. It is here to stay. Okay. Are we
I can say that there'll be plenty of the West's ways of doing things for the West itself. The West's influence will still be in the world, but in a very different way to the recent past.
Are we heading toward a new Cold War?
Personally, I don't find this such a persuasive way of framing it. Clearly, the rise of China, and this is, I've lived and worked in Singapore for 4 years, so I've lived in quite close proximity to the impact of the rise of China. Obviously, we're not next to China, but we are close by. And it's a temptation, I think, to say, well, the US leads the G7 and it leads NATO and it leads democracies, quote unquote. And then China leads the BRICS, the expanding club of nations, and therefore there's a Cold War we have to choose. So the big difference between the Cold War as it began in the 1940s and 50s, we know from our history, is that many countries in the global south either had only just become independent or were still trying to get their independence. Just think about Indonesia or India. Of course, the situation in the Middle East, you'll know very far better than I do in terms of the specific dates. Africa, 1960s, before many of the colonies ended. Ghana was the first, and that's in the late 50s. So the difference now is that whereas previously these newly independent countries were being told USSR, USA in the first Cold War, this time maybe someone says USA or China, but the autonomy and the independence to be able to club together with others who are from the global south, or if you're a larger country like India, to basically chart your own path and say, I don't choose either side. I will be friends with both. I will take what I want from each. I will be polite to everybody, but I don't understand this world of blocks and confrontations. There is a strong possibility that you can chart a middle path. And just one last observation on this. There are some really clear examples of this, even in countries that Turkey, of course, renamed itself. 100 years ago, it picked a more Latinized name. Again, just a good indicator when the West, the Europeans were totally dominant. If you're Ataturk, you're modernizing Turkey, you want to modernize Turkey on basically European lines, because that's who you're aspiring towards. Turkey renamed itself Turkey, but also it's potentially, as the media reports, Erdogan is interested in joining the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. There's even a rumor that there's an interest in joining the BRICS, which is informal, but nonetheless is possibly something Turkey would choose. And it's still a member of NATO, and it now no longer really wants to join the EU. So how quickly things have changed in terms of, it's not for me to tell Turks what they should and shouldn't do. I'm simply observing the world and trying to convey the complexity of what's happening and try to give readers some sense of how to navigate that complexity, because this is the sign of things to come. Things aren't going to go back to the 1990s or the 2000s when London, Brussels, Washington, Paris, these were the centers of the world and the aspirational edge of modernity. Now they are one version of modernity, one version of aspiration, one set of power brokers among several.
Okay. How do you believe this Westlessness will affect global conflict trends in the world, as we are in the Middle East and we are living in a continuous conflict? How this new trends started to affect these conflicts?
So specifically with regards to 7th October and the current war in the Levant, of course there have been wars around the Palestinian territories, and of course the Lebanese know this again in their lived history for decades. And it's over a century since the end of the British Mandate. So that's not new. What's interesting is that those who watch in detail will see that Fatah and Hamas had a negotiation brokered for them in Beijing. I'm not saying that that will produce a magical result of Palestinian unity, but the idea that Beijing could be a mediator between different factions in a complex war was impossible to imagine, even I think 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Of course, Iran, Saudi Arabia had an agreement to restore diplomatic relations a bit before 7th October, luckily, I think, because at least they had some channels of communication when war sadly engulfed the Middle East once again. I don't think China is automatically a decisive broker of peace, but it's telling, switching conflict, that the Ukrainian foreign minister, now ex-foreign minister, traveled to speak to the Chinese as well. And I think there's a belated realization that in order to deliver peace in complex conflicts, the role of China, possibly the role of India, they may not be decisive, but they are now part of the equation. And again, the sort of the point I put to readers is, you may say, well, so what? All decisions really lie with the US. The thing we're really interested in, who's the next US president. My question to you is, do we think that these trends are staying static where they are now with this particular balance? The US is still the decisive power, others are much lower down. Or do we think that these trends will continue to rebalance? Again, over the next 10, 15 years, what would a viable multi-stakeholder peace process with global guarantors for all sides look like in 2035? That's the sort of thing, if you work in mediation, if you work in the UN, if you're at all affected by conflicts and are wondering how to bring these conflicts to an end, how to stabilize them, those are the sorts of things you should be after. And just one last point on this, I think it's quite credible with Ukraine, a conflict I actually worked in Donbass for a year in the first Russian invasion. So I know a lot about the attempts to mediate in 2014-15 because I was working as part of an international mission in previous role I held. And I think forward to a possible stabilization of Ukraine, maybe not today, maybe not even next year, but at some point the war has to enter a different phase. If Moscow has any guarantors on its side, it will probably be the Chinese, it may even also be the Indians, because they're continuing to trade with Russia. And so, of course, Ukraine will have the Western countries, it will have Poland, Britain, USA, if Harris wins probably the election, offering it guarantees, but then which sides will offer the Russians guarantees? And is that how you might see balance in a way to stabilize the conflict? Not that I'm saying that's desirable or just or equitable, but there are so many conflicts that have ended through messy agreements that have required multiple stakeholders, whether neighboring countries or powerful international trading partners, to say something encouraging and positive to encourage the sides to stop fighting and to encourage them to continue to trade peacefully and to abide by whatever ceasefire or territorial delimitation has been achieved. That, I think, is a sort of thing we're likely to see in the years to come.
As you mentioned, as you pointed out in your book as well, that the future of the Middle East and the world as well will no longer be decided in Geneva or in New York. And I think that's the point you mentioned here. Where do you see the Middle East, the Arab world in this this big transformation in the world order?
That's a great question. I can't pretend to be an expert on the Middle East and the Arab world. It's actually been a number of years since I actually traveled in the region, but I visited Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, Egypt. So I spent time in various parts in Oman. So I've seen different sides and across the Maghreb as well. But it's been a few years since I've been in the Middle East, North Africa region. I've, as I say, largely been in Southeast Asia. Where do I see these parts of the world? Two observations. One is there's some history in my book, but most of it's forward-looking. And when you forward look, you're trying to distinguish between the things in which Westernization has had a big impact versus the things that's actually had a moderate impact versus the things it may have less impact in the future. And what's very clear is that because there's a cultural aspect, it's not only geopolitics, geoeconomics. I've tried to look at issues of identity and self-expression because, as we all know, Westernization has also entailed people like me with heritages from elsewhere coming to the West, or even if you're not in the West, you learn English or French, and we all know the reasons why this is. This allows us to participate.
We will be learning Chinese now.
Well, whether we do or don't, interestingly, I think with language, translation apps may actually freeze and embed the lingua franca being English and, of course, Spanish and French, the European English origin languages, because actually the barriers to translation will drop as the technology improves. That's the other thing. This Westlessness is unfolding against the backdrop of rapid technological change, big population growth in some parts of the world, and the energy transition. So there's many geopolitical trends, geoeconomic trends to factor in. But with regards to the Middle East, what's interesting is that the prevalence in the Arab world of Arabic, of course, the cultural binding that Islam, different denominations Islam has presented, has been part of the insulation for these societies from Westernization across many decades. And I think when I've traveled in the Middle East and you interact with people who have positions or they have a voice, they're in political parties, they're related to ruling parties or whatever else it is, there's an understanding the West was the leader for the last century. So you have to Westernize to some extent, whether it's technology, foreign consultants who live in the Gulf, of course, but come from Europe or North America. You are bringing Western influences in, but you're limiting how much impact they have on your society. That varies depending on where you travel, of course, in the region, because it's such a variable region. But I would say that the pressures to Westernize will probably drop down a level. So I think the pressures to Westernize societies, economic models and political models have probably peaked at some point between the end of the colonial empire era and the end of the Cold War, which is all the history we know across the 20th century. I'd say that the power of the West as a magnet drawing others to its appeal, but also the ability of Western thought leaders and politicians to basically present their versions as the aspirational norm that the world has to settle on. I think that power has probably peaked. And that's not because the West has done anything wrong per se. I think it's also just, it's 30 years since the end of the Cold War, nearly 80 years since the end of World War II. History always shows that the world moves to different eras at different times. To round all that up, of course, I can't tell you about the Middle East because it depends where you are. So much variety from the Levant to the Gulf to Maghreb. One cannot generalize, but one can certainly say with, I think, a high degree of confidence that for many societies, pre-colonial traditions, pre-colonial cultural markers, which have always been protected and preserved, will probably be expressed with less pressure to westernize going into the future. And one thing I'm very interested in is the sort of hybrid political and socio-political models that will probably emerge, because the impact of westernization has been so deep and decisive already, whether it's French speakers in Lebanon, or whether it's, you know, British ways of doing things I sometimes see in Jordan, or because of Transjordan and everything like, so, you know, colonial legacies. Those aren't going to go. And I don't think, and last point on this, I think there's a big difference, and I try to explore this in the book, between being anti-Western versus being non-Western. And I think there may be some people, this is quite a dangerous thing, who become, you know, maybe over-enthusiastic of de-Westernizing their society. And I think there's a danger, of course, that Iran continues down a path like that because of the theocracy in Iran, where it makes it very appealing to appeal to this idea that the West is a corrupting influence, and everything must be put aside. The most extreme, of course, is a Taliban style, which is almost anti-modernity, because, of course, modernity and westernization were quite closely tied together for so long. But I think most sensible people in the Middle East and elsewhere in Africa and Asia, they're just not Western. It's not that they're anti-Western, it's just not Western. So they'll be very happy to balance the aspects of westernization that have accumulated in their societies with other traditions, other influences that they may actually be more able to express and explore and to meld in different hybrid ways. And of course, then there's going to be the influence of whether it's China now, India tomorrow, Indonesia in 30 years, where you actually have different consumer goods, different aspirational ideals, potentially even sources of entertainment that start to then mix and match and meld into ways that I think show us that the West's influences are there but diluted.
Yes, of course. At the political plan, we all know the Gulf countries used to be much connected to the West in terms of policy making, in terms of rearming. Do you see some phenomenon now in this new trends connected to the Gulf countries, since they voted against some of American U.S. resolution in the UN Security Council, and as well as the war in Gaza?
Yeah, so with the Gulf countries, I suppose at a more everyday level, it's very interesting is that you take the biggest one, you know, Saudi Arabia, they have been, Riyadh has been very enthusiastic to pursue a security pact with America. So that, I think, should caution us that with this book, by the way, you're not trying to say, I'm going to exaggerate these trends to just to make a nice point. I'm trying to be accurate. So let's be really clear that the West holds enormous appeal, and America in particular is a very valuable partner. So Saudi Arabia has balanced trying to appeal to Washington, D.C. to get this security deal after years of a strong defense relationship, with joining the BRICS, which Saudi Arabia hasn't made much fanfare of, but it was part of the expansion of BRICS this year, with, and anyone who's traveled through the Gulf will immediately know that the penetration of Chinese technology at a consumer level, but also in terms of infrastructure and other things. So there is I think, an interesting point with the Gulf countries, that they are almost a vision of this future as a sort of a mix and match. And of course, then in some very interesting Gulf countries, which are actually all former British colonies, thinking, you know, of Bahrain and you know, Oman. These places are all had a strong British influence until, you know, maybe just under a century ago. There are still some traces of this, especially in royal families who send their children to be in Sandhurst, British Military Academy, all those sort of old connections. And so you notice history has these layers that layer on top of each other. And I find the Gulf countries to be, not that I've spent too much time in them recently, but very interesting exemplars of this layering effect. And then the next question is, the next layer won't just be, we look to London, we look to Washington, it'll be, well, we look to several places. And of course, the final point on this, which I think UAE is a good exemplar, is there's been no desire to sanction Russia over the Ukrainian invasion. And that's not me making a sort of moral comment either way, just my neutral observation. This is a simple fact that when you look at the countries that joined the G7 and the EU to sanction Russia over its, you know, its atrocious invasion of Ukraine, it was not seen as an important enough issue for some of the Gulf countries, or the Gulf countries, to join in with that. And so if you're Russian, and you may still be able to do business at a personal level or at a company level in the Gulf. So once again, you see multipolarity, which is the kind of the jargonistic term for international relations academics, which thankfully this book, I'm not writing this as an academic book. I've already published my PhD separately, so I can now write in plain language for a wider audience. So there's very rare, sort of uses of terms like multipolarity, but I think that sort of way of understanding the structure of the world is quite apparent in the Gulf already.
Okay, per your word, I want you to define the term Westlessness. Per your word, I want you to define the term Westlessness. What do you say?
So if you define the term Westlessness, you're simply talking about a world in which the West is very present, but has less of an influence in how the rest of the world runs. And that lessening is only relative because it's a lessening from an extraordinary high. But as Sir Isaac Newton said of the laws of physics, what goes up must one day come down. And my contention by using the term Westlessness is let's examine whether that is going to come down by a little or by a lot. And I think there's an enormous amount to play for. So I don't make a firm prediction as to how much influence the West will still have, but I will say that the way the West exercises its influence has to change.
But you are saying that we are already there. This phenomenon has started.
It's depending on how you measure it, it's always been in play because even if you look at the share of GDP, after World War II, the US had its biggest share of global GDP. I think it might have even been close to 50% of global GDP, but that's because the world was devastated after World War II. So by some metrics, there's always been a change. But I think the thing now that's interesting is that these changes are becoming more tangible.
Yeah.
So it's one thing, and this is, I think, for everyday people, but also people who work in business or the media, is that a trend line is not something that affects your day-to-day life. But the way I describe it is because this Westlessness phenomenon is probably speeding up and is going to speed up a bit more. Imagine the ground under your feet is starting to tilt slightly and you start to slide a little bit more and you start to get a sense, well, actually, there is change coming. I think that's where we're at. And I think as a final observation, depending on where someone is located in the world today, this will feel different. So there are some parts of the world where the idea of the West ceasing to have this decisive influence over the world is very, very apparent. There are parts of the world where that's quite a popular idea. And then, of course, there are parts of the West where I think it's going to take some time to get used to how Western influence can be expressed positively and productively, because that's the other point with this book is the West has given a lot of great things to the world. It's helped to define modernity, and it will continue to play, hopefully, a very constructive, very important role. Whether that's people from all over the world sending their children to Harvard or Cambridge or London School of Economics, whether that's people who like to holiday in the West, whether that's people whose favorite pop stars are American. So there's no end to the way the West is able to positively impact things, technology, innovations, everything else. But the circumstances in which that influence is being exercised are changing quite quickly. And I think it's incumbent on us to understand those changes as to how they pertain to our personal working lives, our personal outlooks, our nationalities, and where we live geographically as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was great having you and listening to your explanations. Thank you.